Welcome to Do You Ever Wonder? The show that brings you answers to many of the questions that you may have, but with no one to ask. Do You Ever Wonder is hosted by Mike Haltman, CEO of Hallmark Abstract Service, who, like you, has always been deeply curious about a wide variety of topics. Each week, Mike will be speaking with guests who are leaders in their field and who have inspirational stories to tell. So now, sit back and enjoy the show.
So, welcome to another episode of Do You Ever Wonder? For those of you who are regular listeners and watchers, you might notice that I'm wearing glasses today. That's a first. And also, we're coming to you live from a remote location in New York City, and that's also a first. So if there's any extraneous background noise, I apologize. But today we have a guest. It's going to be fascinating. It's something that I always wonder about, in terms of like how you do certain things with your career, or not with your career, but facing different challenges. And our guest today is Paul Townsend. He's a partner at Robert Gottlieb Law, and he's a defense attorney. He has a podcast of his own called In Summation, and he's been a part of some fascinating cases, and love to hear a little bit more about him. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's all my pleasure. So you worked with the DA's office, and
I started my career as a prosecutor in Brooklyn.
Okay. And did you know a guy last name Schwartz?
Several. I know Robbie Schwartz, who's currently still there, I believe.
Is his father Alan Schwartz?
I don't. It's possible. I know an Alan Schwartz who's a defense lawyer also.
Yeah. I think it's the same guy. Anyway, small world. But so you went from being a prosecutor in Brooklyn, and you went to the other side. Some might say, I don't have an axe to grind in any of this, but some might say the darker side.
Sure. And while I was at the Brooklyn District Attorney's office, it certainly was considered kind of the darker side. As you move up throughout the DA's office, obviously people will start to kind of peel off and do other things. And because criminal law is its own kind of niche, a lot of people who leave the DA's office go into private practice and do criminal defense. And so there's always this kind of when you're inside it, you kind of are looking down at people who turn to the dark side and
Right.
go into private practice as kind of some kind of like cosmic betrayal. But then kind of when you do it, when you get out of the bubble that is being a criminal prosecutor, I think kind of your point of view expands a bit, and you kind of see things a little bit more clearly than when you are kind of given that tunnel vision of training through the prosecutor lens.
Right. So when you're at the prosecutor, it's good guy, bad guy, and it's not a gray area for the most part, right?
That's a very common view. There are a lot of, or there is a lot of nuance in the criminal industry, and I know a lot of prosecutors who would say, well, it's not always quite so black and white. Our job, the job of the prosecutor is not to convict the defendant. The job of the prosecutor is to do justice. And I think that gets lost a lot of the time with a lot of especially younger prosecutors who are very eager and they want to, really pursue their cases. And they don't always take a step back and think to themselves, what does justice look like in this case? And am I actually pursuing it? Because a lot of times the defendant's not really a bad guy or a bad girl. There are really two main types of defendants that we talk about, putting aside the actual innocent people, which is a small subset, but does exist. There are bad people who do bad things, but then there are also good people who did a bad thing. And a lot of times it's really important to keep that distinction in mind when you're looking at what justice looks like for each individual person who's charged with a crime.
Well, it's interesting you say that you. And again, I try to be apolitical as much as possible, regardless of what my political views are. But, one topic that's been big in the media lately, depending, I guess, on which media you watch, is lawfare. And, you talk about, as a prosecutor, you need to have your eye on justice and not necessarily on retribution or on a personal agenda. So, out of curiosity, as an outside observer, since you're no longer with the prosecutor's office, Letitia James, her her pursuit of Donald Trump and the ultimate convictions of him, in your opinion, as a former prosecutor, now a defense attorney, would you say that was justice?
It's a difficult question. So I will try not to dodge it. I will say,
But you're an attorney,
I,
so you will.
I am an attorney. I make a living dodging questions I don't want to answer. But here's what I'll say about that. It is incredibly important that when prosecutors are seeking justice and dispensing and meting out justice, because the power of the prosecutor is so important. It's so weighty. They make the ultimate decision of who to charge and with what. And that has to be done even-handedly. Lawfare, I think everyone would agree, lawfare is a terrible thing. Nobody should be prosecuted based on their political affiliations, based on, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. That is the wrong way to go about doing it. The question isn't, is lawfare good or bad? The question is what was done by Letitia James' office actually lawfare? And if you look at the way that the case was brought and the actual evidence that came out, and I'm talking about the fraud case that Letitia James brought. Trump was alleged to have been inflating the value of certain assets that he had in order to get more favorable loan terms.
Right.
The testimony came out. The banks all got paid back. There was no actual victim. And apparently it's very commonplace for people who are seeking loans to try and get the most favorable terms for the loans possible. So did Donald Trump, right? So did Donald Trump do something that may have violated the letter of the law? It seems very likely that did happen. It seems that he did inflate the value of the assets he was using as collateral for these loans. Was that something that the Attorney General should have spent the millions of dollars of time and resources to actually pursue? The answer, I think, from an independent point of view is no. This is done all the time. And if there are no actual victims, is it a worthwhile use of our Attorney General to pursue somebody fairly clearly because of what their last name is and their political affiliation? I don't think that was the appropriate use. That's not to say that Donald Trump didn't do something wrong, but that particular wrong happens all the time, and we don't typically do anything about it unless somebody gets harmed because of it. And then when somebody gets harmed, we expect the Attorney General to step in.
But even if somebody gets harmed, in this case, where you're dealing with, say, JP Morgan Chase, who's a big boy, and they're going to do their own assessment of the value of an asset. You can say, this building is worth $19 billion. And they'll say, no, it's actually worth $180 million. That's not, that's an opinion. It's opinion. So,
yes, absolutely.
I think, I don't know the letter of the law, but to me, as you said, and you didn't dodge the question, and I appreciate that, it was as a taxpayer, it was not a good use of my money.
Sure. And as somebody who also pays a lot of taxes in New York, it's frustrating for me that this is where I see my money going. And you're absolutely right. So Donald Trump deals, I believe, with Deutsche Bank. That's his preferred lender. Deutsche Bank comes up and their representative takes the stand and says, not only did we get all of our money back at the terms that we all agreed to, we conducted our own independent evaluation of the properties that were listed. We made our own assessment. We acted based on our assessment, not what he told us. And therefore, we were comfortable with the loan terms and we got our money back. So we don't really understand what we're doing here.
That's called bank underwriting. And
yes.
I can
takes
go
place every single day.
Say no, or they're going to say yes. And it's all based on their underwriters and what they assess. So I appreciate the fact that you recognize, and I think everyone does, that prosecution for what it was, and hopefully lawfare is something that's in the rearview mirror, but I doubt it. In any event, You also, and you know what? I rescued a dog from Texas, a little 14-pound dog, and I always kid around that he probably came from Mexico, and he was probably El Chapo's guard dog. And he's,
El Chapo didn't have 14 pounders. I'll tell you
no,
that.
I know, I'm kidding, but that's the joke.
Yeah.
But you did participate on some level, and I don't know what that level is until we talk about it now, on
Sure.
the El Chapo defense.
Yes, I was one of the 4 trial attorneys for his Eastern District of New York trial back in, it started in late fall of 2018 into almost spring of 2019.
That's amazing. And that's the trial that put him away for
Yes,
good.
that was the flagship trial. He was charged in a number of different federal districts, but the Eastern District of New York went first, and that conviction sent him to Supermax, the only Supermax facility out in Colorado. And so all of the other federal districts just kind of said, well, he's not really going anywhere at this point.
Right.
So they
That
just let it go.
Supermax would probably be interesting to go on a tour. But,
It is very interesting.
were you
I've
there?
been there one time. There's very limited space that they will let even attorneys go into, but it is a scary place.
Is it below ground?
No, at least not the part where the attorneys can see their clients. They may have some, nefarious
The
basement where
dungeon.
they,
You got to have a
do
dungeon. It's
solitary.
a prison. Right.
Yeah. Oh, it's a prison, but it's, I've been to a number of prisons and jails. I spend a decent amount of time in Rikers Island and at the Metropolitan Detention Center, which is like the federal pretrial holding center.
That's the one in Brooklyn, right? Oh,
And
that's downtown.
what's that?
Is that where, what's his name, killed himself?
Epstein, yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, Epstein killed himself in what was the Metropolitan Correctional Center, which is a similar facility in Manhattan, which shortly after he killed himself, allegedly, it got
That's
shut down.
I mean, that is probably, and not to digress from El Chapo, but that is probably one of the most ridiculous things I have heard in the realm of law, that this guy who's in suicide watch, the cameras don't work, and the guards went to play pool, and the
They,
guy,
they, they fell asleep, allegedly.
I mean, and I don't know how gullible do they think we are?
Well, there's a lot of moving pieces that really seem to come together so that of the 30 odd people who are supposed to be watching this guy, nobody
It,
had eyes on him for like 15 minutes.
it was a confluence of factors. The
That's what they tell
stars
us.
had to align.
Yeah.
Funny. Funny. I mean, do you think he committed suicide?
Oh, I don't know. There have been so many different articles written, so much ink spilled. And one thing I've learned over the years, having read news articles about trials that I am participating in as they're going on, is that journalists write what they think will get people to read.
Of course.
I even during the Chapo trial, it was covered in every day in a number of different publications. And so I would read in the morning what was written, in the Post, in the Daily News, in Vice, in whatever. And the accounts varied so much. And half the time I'm reading this thinking, was this person in the same courtroom that I was yesterday? Because that is not what this person said. That's not what happened. That's not what the testimony was. So reading the things about Epstein, what bone broke and how is it possible for a person to do that to themselves? And, there was an extra heavy laundry, shoot that day. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. I find the story that we're given to be questionable, but that doesn't mean that it's not necessarily true. I don't know.
I agree. You know what? We'll never know. But
We probably won't.
the depth of his knowledge of wrongdoing of powerful people just makes you kind of wonder. But in any event, how did you get on the El Chapo trial?
So I was working with another attorney at the time, and so Chapo had been arrested in Mexico, and he had escaped from a Mexican prison twice before. So the United States asked the Mexican government very politely if we could hold on to him this time rather than them, and they, to their credit, agreed, and they shipped him up via plane. And when he got to New York, he met with a number of kind of prominent New York City attorneys. So my colleague and I went to go visit him. And we had a translator there. He didn't speak any English. And we had a very good meeting. It was a little bit unorthodox because we figured, everyone who went in there was going to ask him, questions about who, what happened and what he was doing and the cartel and this and that. And we really spent an hour just talking about his upbringing, talking about what he remembers of his childhood, his parents, his family, what his values are, what's important to him. And he called us a couple days after that and said, "I want you to come back." So we came back and saw him again.
You personalize things.
Yeah, it wasn't our first meeting. We really didn't discuss the case much at all. It was really just about him, and he asked a lot of questions about us, about our personal lives, about what matters to us, about kind of how we approach the practice of law.
He wasn't he's not a big guy, right?
No, he's quite short. El Chapo just actually translates to Shorty because he doesn't actually like the name at all. He gets very upset when you call him that. But it's a nickname that has stuck with him, throughout his life. But yeah, he's a little guy, but he is actually incredibly charismatic and personable. He cracks jokes, which lose something in translation, but he has a very affable demeanor. But you can just tell this is a guy who is not used to hearing the word no. There would be times during our representation where he would have an idea that he wanted to do something, and it would either be completely illegal or just a terrible strategic move.
You mean like
and
kill
so we would
witnesses?
say like, no, we're not going to do that. And you would see behind his eyes this just
Fire.
burning, like, how dare you say no to me?
So the illegal things he wanted you to do, did he want you to kill people?
No, nothing like that. It was trial strategy. He wanted us to put certain motions in that were completely ridiculous. And we would explain to him like, oh, we can't really do that. That's illegal. And usually he would kind of be like, oh, okay, all right, I understand that. But he was he wanted to participate a lot in his case. He had a lot of ideas and he had a lot of strategic decisions that he put forward. And every once in a while, it would be something that we'd say, well, hey, we can incorporate that we can do that. But a lot of the times we're like, no, we're not going to do that.
He didn't, you must have realized, and he must have realized that he was dead to rights, I would assume, or not so much.
This was not a case where we went in saying it's 50-50. We just got to convince, a couple of jurors. We all had a pretty good sense from the beginning, this was basically the world's highest profile drug dealer and mass murderer. And so,
like
what can we do
to minimize
to try and put a defense together?
So when you were sitting there knowing that he has no regard for human life, that he's a murderer and would have no compunction if he had a gun of blowing your head off, were you nervous at all?
No. Largely those types of situations where the lawyer gets threatened or whatever, that's very Hollywood. It almost never happens, even with really, really dangerous people. They typically do not threaten the lawyer that's doing their best to help them. It's rare. I never, during the course of our representation, during the course of the trial, I never once felt, like I've pissed him off. Am I going to have a cartel person waiting at my driveway when I get home tonight?
So ultimately, you're trying to defend him, and everyone, although he's not an American citizen, he has a right to strong.
He has a right to a fair trial.
Right. Was the strategy to get him off, or was the strategy to try and minimize his sentence?
It's both. Minimizing a sentence in this case because of what he was charged with, which is, continuing criminal enterprise, which is like RICO on steroids.
Right.
You know that if he's convicted, it's going to be multiple life sentences,
Right.
to run consecutively. We're not talking about the difference. Like if we do really well, maybe he'll get sentenced to 10 years instead of 20. No, our strategy, when you're trying a case, your strategy is always, I want to win. How do I win? Even when you're facing insane uphill odds, you're always thinking, how can I poke holes in the government's case? How can I show, that there are weaknesses? Where can I insert just a tiny bit of reasonable doubt? And how can I latch on to some aspect of this case and say they haven't proven what they needed to prove, and therefore you can't convict this guy?
So
Sometimes that's easier than others.
So let me ask you this, and
Mhm,
coming from the prosecutor's office to being a defense attorney,
mhm.
sitting in front of El Chapo and hearing his story, knowing that in your mind you must assume he's done what he's done, or you have to. I mean, is there a? I guess what I'm asking, because every time I see somebody defending like a heinous person, you say ethically, you, or personally. I mean, you're a good guy, and how do you? Yes, people are you they get good representation and they're entitled to a fair trial. But by the same token, do you? I guess my question is internally, do you ever have ethical struggles?
This is the question as a defense attorney I get more than any other. How do you defend horrible people who've done horrible things? And I've represented some really gross people. From a personal point of view, El Chapo is not even the worst person that I've represented.
Is that right?
Um, yeah, so I can understand. I
Wait,
can
wait.
understand in El
Do you have a
Chapo.
name? Who's the
I
worst person you ever represented?
I will say I don't give names of my clients, but I'll say what they did or what they're accused of and what
Okay.
they're
Yeah.
ultimately
What did they
convicted
What
of.
did they do?
So the worst people, the worst category of people that I have represented are child molesters.
Mm,
People who actively pursue children for their own sexual gratification and ruin kids' lives. They
right.
ruin it. The entire rest of the life. This person is so traumatized and so broken as a result of what my client has done to them that they will never fully recover. And I understand that and I appreciate that. And my heart breaks for victims of child molestation. But my job is to make sure that when somebody is accused of a crime, that the government has to prove every element of that crime beyond a reasonable doubt. Because the way our system works is if the government can't prove that you did it, you don't deserve to be punished for it, even if you did it. Because when we start allowing, well, he's a bad guy, well, he's just terrible, he's done this 10 times before, so we know he did it this time also. When we start eroding that systematic framework, that institution of innocent until proven guilty, other crimes are not evidence in this case that you did it, we start giving the government a foothold to start cracking away at the fundamental rights that we as citizens or just people who happen to be in this country accused of a crime enjoy. And what we've seen with government, with prosecutors, is when you give them a foothold, they will latch on and they will seek more. They will seek more. And it's not because they're bad people. And it's not because they're trying to erode the fabric of society or anything like that. But they have a natural tendency to push the line to see what they can get away with, the same as defense attorneys do. We do it too. We push the line. We see what we can get away with. We all try and work within the confines of the rule of law. But if somebody sees that they're getting an advantage, that they're able to get a toehold onto this particular thing, and they can push themselves a little further, they can push that line a bit, they're going to do it. So my job is to make sure that my clients' rights are zealously safeguarded and advocated for, because I'm the first, last, and only line of defense for these people.
Right.
And so I have to set aside and say, my defending somebody who's done a terrible thing, whether it's lighting people on fire, whether it's selling tons and tons of illegal drugs, whether it's molesting a child, that doesn't mean that I support what they did. I find what they do abhorrent. But as a human being, they are entitled to have somebody stand up for them and say to the government, you better be able to prove what you're saying this person did.
That's fair. And you're a good sounding board for me because I always have a lot of questions when I see a case, I see the defense attorney. Do you ever get pushback when you leave the courthouse, when you go back to your family and friends? You're
Sure.
defending El Chapo. What the fuck are you doing?
Yeah,
I mean,
all the time. The El Chapo case, my father had a a bit of an internal conflict with, and we had a long conversation, and he said, how do you how do you
You
sit
do.
next to this person every day in court? How do you stand up and advocate for them? And I told him, basically what I just told you is
Right.
that it's so fundamentally important, because I think the way that we treat the prosecution of the worst among us is emblematic of how we treat people in our society.
Yeah.
If we're willing to just shove the bottom 10% away, then there's going to be a new bottom 10% soon enough, and then they're going to get shoved away.
100%. It's a very slippery slope, but I don't disagree that the worst of the worst demand fair trials. But when you see abuses of the system, it makes you question the system.
Sure. And there are times that I will, you know, the popular aphorism is, "But my guy got off on a technicality." Maybe the evidence was there to convict my client, but I saw that there was some snafu that was done. Some problem that was made, some omission, some error, some filing issue, or some time limit that was breached. And so I'm able to exploit that and get my person's case dismissed, even though there's evidence that he really victimized or she really victimized somebody. But you know what? It's incumbent on prosecutors to act within the bounds of the law when they are prosecuting somebody.
Right.
We do not want our judges to paper over procedural mistakes that prosecutors make, the same way that we don't want judges to paper over procedural mistakes that defense attorneys make.
I
It
agree.
is incumbent on everybody to do their job correctly and to be held accountable when they screw up. And if you're a prosecutor and you screw up, my client is entitled to have his case dismissed because you didn't follow what the law
Absolutely.
mandates you do.
I agree with that. Now, the last thing I'd like to, and this is from your In Summation podcast, which if
Sure.
you don't subscribe, you should. Uh, the Daniel Penny case. Do you think
Mhm.
that was prosecuted along the letters of the way that a case should be prosecuted? Do you agree with his arrest? Do you agree with the way the prosecutors uh, did the trial?
So, do I agree that he should have been arrested? Yes. Do I agree with virtually anything the prosecution did after that? No. I think Alvin Bragg's office botched this case in ways that are so unbelievably horrifying and embarrassing for that office. I think he should have been convicted of manslaughter. I think this was a real an important case to demonstrate the line between when somebody can step in either self-defense or defense of another, which is a valid defense. I use it frequently myself. But when you have a situation where somebody, Daniel Penny, is acting on behalf of some strap hangers because a man like Jordan Neely, who's clearly going through some sort of mental distress and is loud, aggressive, there's no question that he was threatening, that he was scaring everybody in there. And Penny puts him in a chokehold on the ground for almost 6 minutes. And 2.5 of those minutes, Neely is no longer fighting. He's not responsive. He's unconscious. And
However,
so I think, yeah, go
when the
ahead.
cops came, he was still breathing.
He
But the
was still
cop,
breathing, but he was in
but
such distress at that point that he was never able to be resuscitated.
but the
So I
cops
don't
didn't.
blame Penny for acting. I don't blame him for subduing him. But I think that there's a line where he went
No
too
question.
far and he consciously disregarded the risk that choking out an unconscious person for an additional 2.5 minutes, especially in light of the fact that he's a former Marine who had training in chokeholds. I think that you're consciously disregarding the risk at that point that you could really cause serious physical injury or death. I think had it been a 3-minute chokehold and then he let him go, and even at that point, if he had died, but he was still conscious and struggling, and he had just kind of calmed down a bit, I would say no, he shouldn't be arrested. That was a valid exercise of defense of another. But I think he went too far. And that's where, if you listen to the episode, I had a guest host on who took the position that he never should have been arrested. This was a valid exercise of defense of another. And we went back and forth a lot. And I understand that position. I am sympathetic to it. I see that there is some merit in it, But for me personally, I don't fall on that side of the line.
Okay.
I think it was an appropriate arrest, and I think that they just completely botched prosecuting the guy.
Well, I do know that, if somebody breaks down my front door and is coming at me with a knife and I blow them away with my shotgun, that more likely than not, I'm going to be arrested. Because you have to prove imminent fear of your life, is my understanding.
Yes. So you might be arrested in that scenario. And look, there's going to be a case specific thing. If you have a living room that's, say, 50 feet long and a guy breaks in with a knife and it's
and
on
he's 50
video
feet
and you just
away.
immediately raise your gun and blow him away and you don't even say like, get out of here, drop your knife, I'm armed, cease and desist. Maybe. I would still argue though, if somebody breaks into your house wielding a knife, you're in reasonable fear for your life.
I don't disagree, but sometimes there's different ways that
it's
that's handled.
Always,
but
every self-defense case is very fact specific. You have to look at exactly what was going on, and it asks you to put yourself in the mind of the defendant, which is a hard thing for juries to do. It's hard for them to know because you're asking them to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that this person committed a crime. And the defense attorney is saying, no, you have reasonable doubts because he was thinking this. He was, in his mind, this was the reality that he's operating under. And you're talking about split-second decisions, although in this one we have about a 6-minute decision. But it becomes difficult.
That's like when, when a cop goes into a dark stairwell and somebody makes a move. Are you in imminent fear of your life? Should you wait a few seconds and see what it is? I think it's walk a mile in my shoes, whether, what's fearful to me is different than what's fearful to you. If I'm, if somebody breaks into my house and is 50 feet away with a knife, I don't disagree that maybe I should wait till they get a little closer. But, emotion is a funny thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and look, self-defense is at one point a very difficult thing, but it's also one of the most fundamentally easy defenses to argue. It all turns on how good you are at convincing a jury that this person was in real mortal fear. And a lot of times that requires the defendant to testify, but not always, as we've seen.
It's interesting. You know what? I got to tell you, our time is up, but this has been a fascinating look at something that I think, I always think about. It's always, some of the things we talked about are always on my mind, and you've explained them, and some people agree, some people will disagree, but, a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Do You Ever Wonder? And we hope that you enjoyed the show. Next week, we will have another terrific guest telling their story. And if there are any specific topics you'd like to hear more about, please don't hesitate to let us know. Our curiosity, like yours, knows no bounds. Please subscribe and like and share this episode on your social media. See you next week.